Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for coming today. My name's Scott Lincicome. I'm the Vice President of General Economics and Trade here at the Cato Institute. And we today are going to talk about presidential tariff authority and a possible chance for reform. I'm thrilled to be joined by Representative Suzan DelBene of Washington State. Now, before I begin, a couple housekeeping things. Due to a rather well-publicized scheduling change in the House of Representatives, we have a bit of a tighter time schedule than we originally advertised. So we're going to move straight into a discussion after I give a very short table setter on why we're here today. Representative DelBene will then jet off to vote, and then I'll bat cleanup with some audience Q&A on my own behalf. I promise it won't be on yours. And with that, let's please get started. Again, thank you so much for coming. We're going to talk about tariff laws and tariff reforms. Now, believe it or not, Congress actually has constitutional authority over most of U.S. trade policy. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution here, we have free copies for anybody who wants one, actually gives tariff power to Congress. And for the first about 150 years of the United States history, tariffs were set via legislation. Now, this was not always great policy. And after 2 world wars and the famous Smoot-Hawley tariff debacle, for those of you who enjoy Ferris Bueller, you know this well, modern U.S. trade policy was born. Trade deals were negotiated generally by the president and approved by Congress. Tariff rates were gradually lowered on a general most favored nation basis, we call it. And Congress delegated to the president wide authority to increase tariffs under certain circumstances, under the assumption that he wouldn't abuse that power because the president had a national constituency and foreign affairs powers and economic advisors and the rest of that. This system worked actually pretty well for 70 plus years. Tariffs gradually went down. Economic growth grew, the economy grew. We entered into a bunch of trade agreements, and we had a bunch of pesky protectionist things that we at Cato complained about, but generally U.S. tariff rates were low and trade flourished. Then came President Donald Trump. Using several little-used laws in 2017, 2018, and beyond, Trump imposed tariffs on metals, washing machines, solar panels, and Chinese goods. He negotiated a handful of small deals related to those tariffs, and he did it all without much of any congressional input. Now, of course, President Trump left office, and unfortunately, President Biden wasn't a major improvement in this regard. He imposed some of his own tariffs. He negotiated some of his own tariff-related deals. But more importantly, in my opinion at least, he defended tariff powers in U.S. courts and didn't push to reform the trade laws that many of us had been warning about for quite a while. So here we are with Trump 2.0. Trump, of course, has now turned up all of this tariff stuff to 11. In just his first 2.5 months, Donald Trump imposed or proposed 10 times the level of his first-term tariffs, and those took 2.5 years to implement. He also used a new law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that didn't even mention tariffs or expressly require process or notice that those other tariff laws required. He changed the tariffs constantly. He's still changing them today. He added some additional national security tariffs. He started and finished deals with foreign governments. He threatened even more tariffs. He defended them in court, even after being unanimously overruled by the Court of International Trade. And again, through it all, he never involved Congress. Because of this mayhem and related market reaction, there's been a renewed interest in reforming the laws that the president has, any president has, to potentially do a lot of this tariff stuff without Congress. The courts can litigate whether that's correct, but those are the laws we have, and reform efforts are now underway. One such proposal has been offered by our guest, and I'm thrilled to have her here. Last I checked, your legislation has about 70 co-sponsors. That's great. And I'm delighted to dig into the issue today. So with that, please join me in welcoming Representative DelBene.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, everyone. This is an incredibly important topic, and I am happy to be here with folks who understand how critically important this is, that Congress takes back its authority. I come from the great state of Washington, the most trade-dependent state in the country. So when we're talking about the impact of tariffs, of kind of the whiplash of policy changing back and forth all the time, we feel it across our region, and we feel it in our ports and what's coming in and out of our ports, but American manufacturers are feeling it. All it takes is a couple components in a product that's built right here in the United States to feel incredible disruption, struggle with competitiveness internationally, and we know how intricate and complex supply chains can be. We learned a lot during COVID, and now you throw another wrench in the works and make it incredibly difficult for folks. And again, that impacts us right here at home, and there's no certainty going forward. And maybe one of the biggest things that any type of organization and business depends on is some type of certainty. And Congress provided that certainty, having things go through Congress, making sure that they had to go through that process of input from members of Congress from all over the country, looking at legislation, arguing why it would make a difference in their part of the country, thinking about the impacts, people coming together to pass legislation gave it stability and certainty beyond any one executive, which is also critically important. And so while there are definitely authorities that the executive has that I would say are more narrow in terms of what they were put in place for, so that things can move faster, they were not anticipated to be used in the way they are now. And it should be a very bipartisan effort to change things. So I'm glad we have the opportunity to dig into this a little bit more. It's critically important, and given that August 1st is coming, it's even more important, as this is a very active discussion right this moment.
For those who don't know in the audience, August 1st is our latest deadline for a lot of these Liberation Day reciprocal tariffs. And we can expect more of this type of discussion, some would say chaos, in the weeks ahead, and probably after that too, if recent history holds. Now, Representative, I went over a little bit of the tariff history, a little bit of Trump 1.0, but I was hoping you could add some color from the Hill on a few things. First, tell us a little bit about what your proposal does and why it's needed. And then I think, maybe to get a little more personal, you've been around in Congress for a little while, and I'd be curious as to why you are reconsidering maybe some tariff powers you didn't think much about back in the good old days, and why now you think it's a little more urgent. I know you mentioned a bit about uncertainty and some of these things, but I'd like to kind of hear, why now for you?
Well, and I'll say why now because of the damage that is being done, but I felt this way beforehand too. I think that Congress has an important role to play in that stability, and there were Republicans who had agreed with that under the last administration. We had bipartisan support to make sure we were clear that Congress had to be consulted. And it is stunning how we moved into this Congress, and some of those very same voices on the Republican side are very quiet right now. But when you talk about legislation, President Trump has repeatedly looked at putting in place sweeping tariffs and trying to use existing laws to justify his ability to do so. And one of those, as you said, was IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And the emergency I think he put out there was that there was a fentanyl emergency, except more fentanyl goes into Canada from the US than comes into Canada into the US. And so Nonetheless, they've continued to move forward. So we've challenged that, and Congress has challenged this declaration of emergency, and there's been an ongoing attempt to prevent us from voting on legislation to say that this isn't an emergency, that this isn't a reasoning that you can use to support the tariffs. This is more specific to Canada and Mexico. I've introduced legislation called the Prevent Tariff Abuse Act to make it clear that this law was not put in place and cannot be used in the way that's being used here. So it is much more clearly, narrowly defined just to prevent any interpretation that is more broad. I don't think that it was ever intended to be used in the way it is, but if we're going to do something to make it even more clear, then we'll do something to make it even more clear. But there's also legislation on Section 232, legislation on Section 338, on Section 122, combination legislation that's been introduced to kind of address multiple different authorities that are in place. All of these pieces of legislation are to try to make it very, very clear that the executive cannot just go around Congress and try to put any type of authority in place that comes up any day. And so again, Republicans have fallen silent. These are issues that should be very bipartisan because, as I said, under President Biden, we heard Republicans saying over and over and over again that they wanted to make sure things must go through Congress. Congress must be consulted. And we're going to continue to push because it's critically important that we don't allow trade policy in this way, tariffs, to be used kind of in a wanton way and in a punitive way that could be unknown. I may, you may like you today, I may not like you tomorrow, and that alone could be a change.
Yeah. No, you mentioned process. I think that's one of the things that's really startling about this time around. In my former life, I was a lawyer and litigated some of the Trump 1.0 tariffs. And, I had a lot of problems with those, but businesses and government officials had a chance to at least provide comments and provide data. And then that data was by the Commerce Department, by United States Trade Representative analyzed. Congress had a chance to have consultations. I don't know how much that actually happened, but there was an opportunity. This time around, you go to bed on a Friday, you wake up on a Monday, and you have new tariffs. You talk to business owners out there, and they will say, this makes no sense. I'm a manufacturer, and this doesn't work. And that's, I think, one of the really startling changes this time around. And they have lots of these charts for economic uncertainty. Just completely now, we keep having to add higher y-axes because the bar, it just keeps going up, all this uncertainty, which of course has real effects on the real economy. Now, speaking of the economy, there's a lot of fog right now about how tariffs are affecting the U.S. economy right at this moment. Now, some of that is very boring things like just a lag in data reporting, and others is just the reality of national stats kind of washing out trade-related stuff. We're a giant $30 trillion services economy. It's kind of hard to pick up little minutia on trade. But I think it'd be great or interesting to hear what you're hearing on the ground, specifically from constituents. You mentioned Washington State, you mentioned manufacturing. One of the stats we throw around a lot at Cato is that about half of everything we import into the United States are actually manufacturing inputs. So when you put tariffs on those things, you end up harming a lot of manufacturers, which does make a lot of sense. So if you could maybe add a little color, what have you been hearing from your constituents?
Well, there's one story in particular that I think kind of summed it up, which is a small manufacturer in our region that makes components that are shipped internationally. And he said, I'm being tariffed out of business. And it wasn't any one particular tariff. It absolutely was the uncertainty. International customers of his were saying, I just need to find some place where I have more certainty and stability on pricing. I don't know what's going to have pricing on your side, what retaliation might mean. So I'm going to look for places where there's more certainty and stability. And that was impacting his business. Nothing that he was doing wrong, but it was this idea that the U.S. is going to be kind of in these constant battles and folks don't know where it's going to go. And again, the uncertainty alone is incredibly damaging. But we're seeing big impacts on agriculture. Another good example, I talked to a winery in our region that shipped a lot of their product into Canada. One day, they're shipping about 30% of their product in Canada. Trump starts with his first round of tariffs against Canada. Basically, the next week, he's shipping nothing into Canada. No one was mad at him. No, there's still interest in his product probably, but product wasn't on the shelf anymore. That meant that a huge chunk of his market was gone. He had more inventory that he was going to sell probably in the U.S. at this point, and so that kind of depressed prices there. Again, no warning, no planning, and nothing that he did wrong or that his business did wrong, all because of a whim from the administration. And the list goes on and on. Tourism is down from Canada. We're a border state, but if you look across the board, there have been flights that have normal flights back and forth into the U.S. from Canada that have been canceled. We can go on and on with the impacts of tariffs, uncertainty, and kind of the battles going back and forth. And then it is just the prices of goods that go up. These are taxes on families. We know that consumers are paying for higher costs. And so in different industries, those come through, and we know that a lot of folks ordered a lot of product early to try to avoid it, and so that's kind of played into the system. But now, as we go forward, that ongoing uncertainty, folks looking for other markets, closure of markets to our exporters, all of that is creating a lot of damage, and we still don't know what's ahead.
Yeah, you listen to the retailers, they're very clear that, they stockpiled in advance. You can see it in the import data. It's just massive spike until about March. But they're running out of that inventory, and this gets back to kind of that lag. I mean, we kind of know this sword of Damocles kind of hanging there, and yet there's one guy, like you said. I think that's, again, why getting some say from Congress back in this is so important. I know there's a lot of hope for the courts to do this as well, but that strikes me as a bit of a imperfect solution in a lot of ways.
Congress should act.
Right.
Congress absolutely should act, and it should be bipartisan support. I think, there is at least, theoretically bipartisan support, but there has not been courage on the Republican side to act on that. There should be consultation. The rules and laws as they are in place have not been followed in terms of consulting with Congress, letting Congress know about policy that's proposed ahead of time before taking action. All of those things are critically important, not only to helping make sure there's awareness and feedback on policy, but also that we're talking about what the plan is. Like, why are we doing this? I would argue a lot of people don't even know why, what the reasoning is behind the actions that the president has taken. He talked about 90 deals in 90 days. That didn't happen. He talks about doing deals where it's unclear what those deals are. They're not complete trade deals, because if they were real trade deals, again, those should come to Congress. And if he can undermine USMCA like he did with the tariffs on Canada and Mexico so quickly, then what's to say he can't undermine any other deal if he wants to, even days after he puts it in place? That's terrible for planning and investment. It's terrible for domestic production in terms of helping make sure there's certainty going forward. But it also is terrible in terms of our relations internationally, what that means in terms of opportunities for exports. And we have a lot of businesses, and our farmers are another example, where they've had export opportunities that are impacted by these decisions. Yeah, retaliation is always against ag at first, right. It seems like.
But, and one of the things you mentioned that I think is very fascinating about this episode of U.S. trade policy is that some of the retaliation isn't even from foreign governments. It's just from foreign individuals. Again, one of the things we talk about at Cato a lot is that trade is between individuals. And this is a rather stark, somewhat depressing example of how that works in the real world, right? Where Canadians aren't traveling as much to the United States, hurting the US tourism industry, which is an export, actually. It's very weird and wonky, but tourism in the United States is an export to these foreign countries. Consumers are not buying Washington wines. And by the way, I'm happy to take some Washington wine. I'm a huge fan.
We'll make sure they do.
So please send them my way. That's a bad example, but otherwise, that's a problem. And you hear in Europe, American brands are seeing slightly depressed sales as well. Again, not from the governments themselves, but from the individuals. Now, in terms of, again, as part of the U.S. government, do you see the potential for this providing a long-term problem for U.S. commercial interests abroad? I mean, is there the chance that a lot of the rest of the world just says, Canada included, says, to heck with those guys, that's just too much uncertainty, we don't like the tariffs anyway, let's just move on?
Well, I think we've seen that business example I gave earlier. If more and more of someone's customers are moving and finding other places to do business that provide that stability, even if tariffs went away tomorrow, it doesn't mean that that business comes back instantaneously. We know how easy it is to break things. We know how hard it is for us to put those things back together. So it's with Canada, all the disparaging comments that went along with that, of being a 51st state or wherever it might be, that impacted folks' willingness and interest to do business in the United States too. So don't think that that doesn't have. And when we look at international trade, if the U.S. is not at the table and talking about how we're engaged and involved, we're going to have others look to other partners for those economic relationships. And many others, including China, will be there to try to fill those gaps that are left.
For sure. Supply chains, once they change, they don't come back without a reason. Once people get a hankering for Chilean wine, then Washington might struggle a little bit, although I still prefer the Washington Reds.
He knows to be careful.
Personally, no, it's actually true though. So I'm not just buttering you up. So let's get back to your legislative proposal, and if I can maybe needle you a little bit here, why weren't Democrats as active during the Biden years doing some of this as well? I'll freely admit that prior to 2016, I didn't have a lot of interest in trade law reform beyond maybe the anti-dumping law and some of that other very technical stuff. It was only after actually reviewing these statutes and realizing how much chaos a single person can inflict on the U.S. economy that I realized, wow, something really needs to be done. But we've been banging this drum now for a while. 2017, 2019, 2021. Clark Packard and I, quick shout out to our paper on tariff law reform that we issued in October, practically begging Democrats in Congress to do something before President Biden left. So what happened?
Legislation like the legislation I was talking about was legislation we worked on last Congress too. This wasn't something that just started. I think there has been, and so it wasn't a big change, and it was, bipartisan effort there, but all of a sudden it went from bipartisan to not partisan now. So there was a bipartisan, in fact, one of the hearings that we had on the Ways and Means Committee that I sit on trade, all I did was quote my Republican colleagues on comments they had made under the last administration about how important it was for there to be congressional authority, things that I agreed with and that I also said in the Biden administration. Yeah. And yet, if they would speak up now, we would be moving legislation in Congress to make it clear that the president has to come to Congress. You saw the Senate try to move on this and legislation not get through. In fact, tiebreaker, in terms of, I think Vice President Vance had to come break the tie in that legislation to prevent that from going forward. There needs to be bipartisan support to, we're in the minority by 3 seats, so we can bring a lot of the votes to the table. We don't even need a lot of Republicans to come to the table on something that, from an ideological standpoint, many of them have said in the past that they agree with. So this comes down to, are these truly your values? Are they only unique to a particular administration or not? If you really believe that you want to make sure we have a check that Congress has its authority and that is being used, clearly there's been litigation too, then let us vote on a bill. Put it out there. Republicans are in the majority. We can't move a bill without it through committee or put it on the floor. But it won't take many Republicans to actually just put out there, let there be a vote. If folks want to vote against it, they can vote against it. But folks don't want us to vote at all.
Yeah, that's one of the more frustrating things, I think, watching from the cheap seats over here is we don't get to debate the substance. It's these procedural moves that really prevent there from ever being a vote. Now, I know that's kind of classic Washington inside baseball stuff, but it's, in this case, we're talking about trillions of dollars worth of annual commerce that's being affected by one person.
And the long-term impacts that has. Right. Like I said, you can change the policy. There's been a lot of just talk about it's going to happen today, like even August 1st. Does it happen August 1st? Does he change his mind? Does it not? You've seen the markets respond to that. The markets then have said, well, maybe we don't think he's going to talk, but he's not really going to do anything, so we shouldn't react because it probably won't happen anyway. The fact is that folks don't know, right. But it should never be that way. And I would argue it reeks of corruption to have one individual be able to decide, I'm going to put a tariff on you tomorrow or take it off tomorrow, or you're going to negotiate a deal just with me that will determine what happens. That absolutely cannot be our path going forward. Another reason why Congress is a co-equal branch of government, why we have authority, and I would talk about this with respect to trade and tariffs, but also on spending authority and how critically important that the power of the purse, that Congress acts and maintains that power of the purse, which is also something people should be very concerned about and under threat given recent actions, that all of that is so important to make sure that our systems of checks and balances are working.
Yeah, if the president imposed a new income tax tomorrow and just started collecting it unilaterally, there'd be a lot of people complaining, crying out for that, but he does it he calls it a tariff, and suddenly, no, it's okay.
And a tariff to a lot of people isn't different than a tax.
Exactly. I got to say on the we don't know point, it's one of the nice things about being out of big law is that I can say I don't know a lot more. Back in the day, though, with a lot of businesses, I don't know isn't a good answer. They have to keep their businesses running. And, one of the things you said on the corruption side of it that maybe we can talk a little bit about, a little more about is, this seems to really benefit big businesses, ones that have access, whether it's to the White House or the government in some way, whereas the little guys, the constituent you mentioned that needs access to either the Canadian market or one that needs a single part from a single place, can't diversify suppliers. So how is that, do you think, going to affect the economy? What have you heard in that?
Well, I think a lot of big businesses are impacted too, because especially for an exporter, I come from a place where we might export a lot in aerospace and technology. If your market, if places, foreign markets where you had a lot of sales are suddenly being cut off because of this, right? Because we talk about tariffs on the US side, but the retaliation or folks looking to buy from other markets, if that continues to happen, that has a big impact on companies large and small. We don't know if we had a trade deal or a more of a broad agreement on something, you might have an exclusion process or some way you would understand how someone would appeal a process or make a case to why a tariff on their goods or in their industry was problematic. Do we have such a thing? And is that something that's going to be subject to a whim, or is it going to follow a very deliberative process? So if you have influence and opportunity, would you be able to get some tariff relief versus someone else. These are all the things that should be not only hugely concerning, but end up in a place where they might benefit folks who are, well-connected versus folks who are just trying to do business like they have day to day. And I do think it's hugely important that folks in the business community, big or small, speak out about what the impacts are. We've had a lot of folks and farmers talk about the impact that not only the uncertainty has, the kind of ongoing tariffs that have been put in place, the kind of threat to raise those tariffs, the access on supply chains and the challenges on supply chains, all of that. I think it's really important for folks to speak out about what that means. It's one thing when you hear about it from a legislator. It's another thing when folks on the ground are talking about how it's impacting people right at home.
Yeah, on the exclusions point, I think that's a really important one to emphasize. I have a ton of problems with the first Trump administration's trade policy, but they had a rather transparent exclusion process. You could go to the government, you could fill out a form, you could seek an exclusion. There were criteria. The product wasn't made in the United States. It would cause major economic harm to your company. We don't have any of that this time around. And like you said, there seems to be some sort of informal exclusion process that runs through one person. If you seem to know the right people, you might be able to get a carve out, but there's no way to actually pursue that, and there's no transparency on how it happens.
And no plan in terms of what the end is, like what you're striving for, what kind of all this uncertainty is supposed to be solving.
Right. Well, you mentioned exports. I think that's a great example. We're doing this to open up markets to exports, but anybody who knows any economics will tell you a tax on imports is a tax on exports, and there's retaliation and currency and uncertainty and the rest, and you end up actually hurting the very people you're trying to help. It doesn't make a lot of sense.
We can do better.
Yeah, for sure. So we're running out of time. I have one last question, the big open question. Where do we go from here? You mentioned there aren't a lot of Republicans publicly interested in moving this stuff. But is there hope, maybe the second half of the year or beyond, to get some sort of discipline on these laws from Congress? Not from the courts, but from Congress.
I mean, I'm always going to have hope because I know those folks who talked about it last Congress, maybe they will decide and maybe they will hear from enough constituents and others about how damaging these policies have been that they will agree to move forward on policy, to put this in check, to say it has, because I think the interesting thing is no one's saying you couldn't put in place a tariff. They're saying you got to come to Congress and make a case for why and get the support to do that. And if you have a good case, then maybe you have a good chance of doing that. But to say, I have a great idea, but I'm not to come to Congress because I don't want to go to you implies that I actually don't have a good case. No one even can understand what it is. That's hugely problematic. And so it shouldn't be this, it shouldn't be so controversial for folks on both sides of the aisle to come and say, we have the authority. It's clear we have the authority. Constitutionally, we have the authority. Come to Congress, make your case, Congress will vote. But you can't go around Congress, and we need to make sure the laws are very, very clear that you can't take legislation that was very limited and try to expand it and do things that were never intended. I don't think that's legal. That was never what is intended. It should be very clear for all of us to clarify that, and hopefully we will find bipartisan support to get there. We don't yet, but we're going to keep pushing, and I think if the public pushes on this, we might see a change.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, you're talking about new taxes, executive power, government accountability, government transparency. These are all things
wrapped
that
up together.
Party, I recall, seemed to used to like. So maybe there is some hope there for us.
Well, I think public sentiment is a powerful thing, too.
Yeah. Great. Well, with that, again, thank you so much.
Thank you
for taking the time. And I apologize that you have to run to go vote, but I do appreciate you being here. Thanks so much. Please
Thanks, everyone.
Join me. Well, now you're stuck with me. I'm happy to take questions from the audience about trade law reform, the state of U.S. tariff and trade policy. I haven't been stuck on Twitter for the last hour, so I'm sure some news broke. I can't talk about whatever the president just posted, but beyond that, I'm happy to do it. So we can take questions from the audience, and also there are some questions online. For those of you who are watching online, you can submit your questions as well, and I'll try to get to them. Sure. Up front. 1 second, wait for the mic. And then we'll...
Good afternoon, Atul Singh from Fair Observer. Great presentation. Quick question. Has there been a study as to the costs, dollar figures of these tariffs, short term, medium term, and long term? And if so, what would the figure be?
Well, right now we're still dealing with a bit of this fog of war situation. But there are several independent analyses, the Tax Foundation, the Yale Budget Lab, and others, that have tried to map out where the tariffs are right at the moment, or at least where they sort of are at the moment. And you're looking at a substantial, we're talking, billions and billions of dollars of lost economic growth, thousands of jobs, and you can find those numbers. In general, tariffs are one of those 95% issues among economists. You can't get economists to agree on the color of the sky, and yet you ask them about tariffs and you get 95% opposed for broad-based tariffs. And the 5%, who knows what they're thinking. But in general, there's just going to be a substantial loss of economic growth, loss of efficiency for the economy, and little impact on things like the trade balance and all of that. So they're out there. They all show roughly the same thing. Again, but this gets back to something I mentioned earlier. I think it's important not to talk about U.S. tariff policy right now simply in terms of, we're going to shave off 0.4% of GDP growth or lose these jobs in the aggregate. Because the reality is, especially for smaller businesses that get kind of washed out in this data, this is life or death. They have one supplier. They can't lobby the government for an exception. They don't have the capital for a long runway. They can't hold big inventories. For these folks, it's tariffs or bankruptcy. And so sometimes we get caught up in the broad-based economic data, the CPI report and all that. And those things are important, but it's also important just to remember that this is a unilateral tax on people's livelihoods, and ones that they were living perfectly legally and fine as of 6 months ago. And as of today, they're wondering if they're going to go out of business, if they haven't already. So we'll go right there. Wait, please wait for the mic and identify yourself. Thanks.
Mike Nelson with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. A lot of this has to do with the way Trump is selling his vision of the global economy. And I'd be interested in hearing from you the one or two lies that you would most like to see corrected. I'm concerned that he still does believe that those other people over there, they're going to pay the tariffs. And he seems to believe that services don't exist.
Well, those are two good ones.
Well, give me two more.
I think one of the big ones is that broad-based tariffs in particular are good for American manufacturing. The three numbers I throw around in this regard, I already mentioned one of them, right? About half of all imports into the United States are industrial inputs. If you slap big taxes on steel and make the price of steel go up, you harm downstream manufacturers. When we did that during Trump 1.0, we lost far more manufacturing jobs than we gained. We had smaller manufacturing output. The same goes for aircraft parts, as Representative DelBene mentioned, and all sorts of other things. And quite frankly, if you talk to a lot of American manufacturers right now, they are not doing great. And if you look at the national Again, aggregate data for manufacturing output and employment, it's either stagnant or declining. The Richmond Fed yesterday had an absolutely brutal report for the state of Mid-Atlantic manufacturing. Now, that's not all tariff related, but sure as heck, bet a lot of it is. So I think that's a really big one. A lot of people like manufacturing. Hey, manufacturing good, services, of course, are good too. But the idea that slapping massive tariffs on imports from your close allies is somehow going to improve American manufacturing, that's nonsense. Two more numbers in that regard, just very quickly. About a third of all global trade is companies trading with themselves, what we call intra-company trade. So Boeing out in Washington buys from Boeing that has a factory in Europe. If you put tariffs on Boeing stuff from Europe, Boeing's not just going to go, oh, you got us, we're going to go shop down the street at the aircraft parts store. No, it's a massive capital-intensive process that requires new regulations and qualifying new suppliers, or more likely, especially in the case of foreign companies, they're just going to eat the tariffs. You're just taxing those corporations. And then the last number, 80%. 80% of all American manufacturing workers work at companies that import and export. So they are globally integrated companies. Helping those is impossible. I think the other one that's important, at least for this president, is the idea that tariffs are somehow going to fix the trade deficit. Agree, disagree that the trade deficit is an economic problem to be fixed. We can have long conversations about that. Generally, economists say no unless there are certain drivers that aren't present in the U.S. economy. That aside, you're going to find very few economists that say that slapping a bunch of tariffs on stuff is going to massively change the trade deficit. It's going to take us from a longstanding persistent trade deficit to trade surplus. And you might get a little bit of a rounding error here and there, but that's not going to do it either. So I think those are two really big myths that deserve to be punctured quickly. Sure. Along with the ones you mentioned, because of course foreigners don't pay tariffs and we're a massive services economy. Sure, right here in the second row.
Hi, Mara Lee, International Trade Today. I wanted to ask about this concept that the new deals are going to include rules of origin to prevent Chinese inputs from coming to America in goods that are of Indonesian origin, Vietnamese origin, etc. I wanted to get your take on how long it might be before that would become reality and what kind of evasion and compliance problems that would create.
The first question is I have no idea. I'll just, as a brief aside, give a big fat I told you so to the administration in this regard, because years ago when the China tariffs were imposed, many of us said, look, China is a massive producer of intermediate inputs, so the stuff that goes into other stuff. If you put tariffs on Chinese goods, all of those intermediate products are just going to shift to other countries like Vietnam and India and Mexico and whatever, and you're still going to end up with roughly the same amount of Chinese content in the U.S. economy. Anyway, it's just not going to be done in a direct fashion. It's going to be more opaque and more costly. So it's kind of a dumb thing to do. And now, the big initiative, as just mentioned, is to, well, we're going to go after that Chinese content now. Now that raises two big problems. One is it just means more tariffs, right? And it is effectively a backdoor way to slap tariffs not just on Chinese goods, but on goods from everywhere in the world, unless they can prove that there isn't a bunch of Chinese content in there. And good luck with that, because especially when you're dealing with advanced manufacturing, where you're talking about multiple tiers of suppliers, thousands of companies in complex supply chains for automotive and aerospace, and the stuff that the United States actually does well, right, in manufacturing. So it's a clearly kind of an potential excuse for just slapping tariffs on a bunch of stuff. And you hear protectionists around Washington right now saying, well, to get at China, we need global tariffs. So that aside, how this is all going to shake out is a really important question. It's important, one, simply to figure out, well, what are going to be the criteria? This goes back to the uncertainty. Are we going to move away from a subjective rules of origin standard. Right now, that standard is substantial transformation. I won't bore you with the details, but basically customs has to say that a product has been substantially transformed in, say, Mexico, and then it's suddenly made in Mexico. It just magically happens. It's not a set rule. It's whatever customs basically says. A lot of customs lawyers have made a lot of money filing those types of customs ruling requests. But you could move to a more objective standard. A lot of countries have, say, it has to have 50% content from the originating country. But we don't know if that's what they're going to do. Some FTAs in the United States have this standard. And so until we know what they're planning, it's really hard to say. I think, though, your last point there is the most important, and that is regardless of what they come up with, this is going to be an administrative nightmare. So we have a system, or we had a system as of January 1st, give or take, where almost every product from everywhere in the world, you didn't have to worry about its rules of origin. We got the MFN tariff rate. That was it. It got 3% or 0% or whatever. End of story. So manufacturers, retailers, the rest, that was it. Now, given the wildly varying tariff rates for various countries, given the clear efforts that people will engage in to evade tariffs or get the lowest tariff liability possible. You hear famous stories of minivans having the seats ripped out once they get into the United States to avoid a certain tariff level. Now just do that for every product, right? Delta is ripping jet engines out of their planes in Europe because they're made in America jet engines. They can get them back in the country tariff-free. So you're going to do that all the time. But beyond that, just the paperwork to file claims proving your origin. Will it be a guilty until proven innocent system? Or will it be the opposite, which of course then everybody's just going to pretend they qualify. So the only clear answer in all of this is that the lawyers and accountants are going to be buying beach houses in Delaware because of this. It is halcyon days for the trade bar. My former colleagues out there, good luck. Yeah.
What do you think the Court of International Trade is going to do with the appeal they're about to hear very soon?
You mean the Federal Circuit?
Yes, I'm sorry,
Yes,
the
no
Federal
worries.
Circuit.
And could you identify yourself?
He adds and the Supreme Court.
Yep, so could you identify yourself, please?
My name is Louis Rothberg. I'm unaffiliated.
Okay. Good question. For those who don't know, for those online watching, the Court of International Trade, in a really surprisingly stern and unanimous decision in the end of May, of course, right when I was on vacation, ruled President Trump's fentanyl tariffs and reciprocal Liberation Day tariffs to be illegal under the IEEPA. Basically, the court said, IEEPA doesn't let you issue blanket tariffs like this. This is the emergency powers. And oh, by the way, even if it did, it's an unconstitutional delegation because it's just such a broad delegation of Congress's tariff powers. So you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. We're overruling we rule it to be illegal. And they enjoined the tariffs for a brief 15-hour moment. The tariffs were paused. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit has taken up the appeal. The administration appealed immediately. And they unpaused the tariffs, and so they're still in place. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit is hearing that case on an accelerated basis. I'm not sure when we expect a decision. As for the outcome, look, I wish I had a great answer for you. The CAFC has proven particularly deferential to executive power, and particularly on trade. If you look at the Section 232 tariffs, believe it or not, the Court of International Trade ruled a couple instances of those national security tariffs to be illegal. The Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit overturned both of those decisions, finding that the amount of discretion and ambiguity was fine. The president can do it. So that type of deference doesn't give me a lot of optimism. Then again, it's a different law. We're in a wildly different situation. And I would be happily wrong if the CAFC says, like the CIT, this is ridiculous, it's illegal. Of course, though, then it goes to the Supreme Court. Here I actually have more confidence than the CAFC because this particular court has proven particularly skeptical of executive power and congressional delegation. And if you look at the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, this thing is so broad and so vague, so discretionary, that if it allows for global tariffs, it allows for anything, and thus Congress has no tariff power at all. It has effectively given it all to the president, said do what you want, whatever you want, for whatever reason you want. Exactly. So that is, I think, there's a little hope, I think, because of that. But the courts at both the CFC and Supreme Court have also said, hey, Congress, you need to do your job in all this stuff. And the reality is, as Representative DelBene said, Congress has not done its job. We should not let Congress off the hook in all of this. And I'm not saying this now just because she left. The reality is that they've had a decade now to see what these laws can do to a president that is not bound by the typical norms and the rest that we assumed for U.S. trade policy since the 1930s. And they've done nothing. So there is a chance the courts say this is a political question. You need to, Congress do your job. Coin toss, man, is that how it actually comes down? I'm sorry. Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Claire Chen from the American Action Forum, and I'm wondering, you spoke about tariff uncertainty impacting firms' supply chain decisions, and you also said that supply chains once changed don't come back without reason. So I'm just wondering, how do you think about approaching how long-term these changes might be, especially considering this is Trump's last term, and these are like tariff-based changes in decision-making. So how do you approach thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, the bright side is that if the courts don't do anything, if Congress doesn't do anything, these tariffs are implemented via executive action. They can be removed as quickly as they were imposed, theoretically. The problem is beyond the theory. First, we know from a lot of practice that protectionism is incredibly sticky and politically seductive. Once tariffs or other trade measures are in place, it takes years to get rid of them. You create new constituencies that lobby like crazy to maintain their new windfall profits, their jobs, and the rest. I'm looking out at Colin Graybaugh, our Jones Act guru, who will tell you about that law has been in place for now more than a century, despite most people outside of the shipbuilding lobby and the Jones Act lobby saying the thing's a disaster. So there is a chance that the politics make it very difficult for these things to go away, as much as the economics say these things need to go away. And quite frankly, again, throwing a little shade at President Biden and his team, they didn't exactly wipe away all the tariffs when they could have. Stroke of a pen stuff. The steel and aluminum tariffs could have gone away. They could have canceled out the automotive tariffs, and instead now we have automotive tariffs because they just didn't do anything in this regard. And of course, they didn't clean up the laws either. So that the politics makes it a scary proposition that these things might be around for a while. And again, one of the reasons why experts don't dislike protectionism so much isn't just the economics, it's the politics. That it's a tough slog once they're in place. As far as supply chains, this is, I think, going to be one of the more interesting and perhaps depressing issues for the United States going forward. First, American manufacturers are increasingly saying they're not going to invest more here, contra the president. They're going to leave. They're going to set up shop in Canada or Europe or Asia because, hey, they might like the U.S., they might like the American workforce and all these other natural advantages or government advantages we had, but this is just ridiculous, right? The uncertainty alone, they want to sell to the US, they'll just pay the tariff. They're better off elsewhere. And once those supply chains change, it's very tough to bring them back. The other big thing that's happening, which I also think is worth very much watching, is other governments are deciding to trade with each other and not us. They are signing FTAs. You know, there's this idea out here that the world has gone populist and protectionist, but actually a lot of governments are signing trade agreements. When the United States abandoned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it became the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership without the US, and then they added the UK, and now they're looking to add other members. Europe is signing trade agreements. Latin America is looking at trade. China is signing trade agreements. Even India is signing trade agreements. And again, once those trade barriers are lowered and US trade barriers remain high, once there aren't rules on regulatory compliance or the non-tariff barrier issues, customs issues, then we're on the outside looking in, and that would be bad. Let's go in the back there. Please wait for the mic.
Hi, my name is David Beatty, and the sanctions against Russia isolated them, and it seems like the tariffs are isolating us, and you have to wonder, is that being, I mean, are they doing that on purpose?
So are we self-sanctioning ourselves? Because yes,
Right.
I'd say yes. I mean in a lot, you know, that's the old quip, right? That protectionism does in times of peace what our enemies do to us in times of war.
Seems we're
Yeah, and look,
we're doing it to ourselves.
I mean, I think that's the reality. If you look at the trade deals that the president is supposedly signing, these are not free trade deals. They are, in some cases, opening up foreign markets, but they're closing our market, which of course is bad, not just for American consumers, that's bad, of course, but it's bad for American manufacturers and American farmers and anybody who needs anything related to the global economy, right? So it is, again, an act of self-sabotage in a lot of ways. You know, I don't find it to be intentional. I think, as I said before, I think the president just really likes tariffs. That's my general thesis is Occam's razor. He just likes tariffs. He thinks they work, no matter what folks like us say. Right there.
Shantanu Kamath, American Enterprise Institute. Let's be hopeful and say that the courts strike down the IEEPA tariffs. I think it's quite obvious based on what Lutnick, Trump, and the others are saying. They're going to shift to alternate tariff authorities. You talk about Section 232. There was also Section 301. What's something else that we're not paying enough attention to in the end game here after hopefully the IEEPA tariffs get struck down? I think you've written previously about, 201 of the Trade Act of 1930, but are there any that we have to be particularly attuned to?
All of them. First of all, great question from a former intern. It's good to see you. Intern at Cato, you can do great things. The reality is that the IEEPA court rulings will be good, but not nearly sufficient. And this is why legislation like what Representative DelBene has offered is so important. This is why Congress getting in the game is so important. If it's not Section 232, steel and aluminum tariffs, automotive tariffs, and a host of others that are supposedly coming on copper and wood products and other things, it could be Section 301. Just say your other countries are doing unfair trade stuff, have an investigation, wait a few months, boom, you get things like the China tariffs that we got in the first time around, which covered half of all Chinese imports. The courts have thus far allowed both the Section 232 tariffs and the 301 tariffs, so you could do that. Section 122 related to balance of payments. Section 338, that's the other one to look at. It's like a paragraph long. That thing should not be a law, but it's hanging out there. And of course, Donald Trump will use it. He's proven that over and over again. If it's in the code, he's going to use it. And so I think those are probably the ones that are most susceptible to this. And I think it's obvious that should the courts rule against the president, he's just going to go back to the drawing board and come back with a new set. And that, again, is why congressional action here is absolutely mandatory. Since you've already asked, let's see if there's anybody else. Yeah, right in the middle.
Hi, Dhruvi Thakur. Thank you so much for organizing this. So you did mention about who is not benefiting from the tariffs, and you also touched upon like the big actors who are benefiting from the same. So who are the immediate winners of tariff war or just like tariffs on other countries? And is this a sustainable win? Is it like a long-term win? And for instance, like some of the big companies do think of it as like profitable for now, but like, is it going to sustain?
Right, so good question. So tariffs do create winners and losers. The reason economists don't like them is they create far more losers than winners, along with all these other economic and political problems. But there are some winners. If you look at, for example, the steel tariffs, you saw a modest increase in steel output. You saw improvements in steel industry profits, so the management went out. You saw, a few jobs added. All of those things are a supposed win for the steel industry. The problems are twofold. One, again, you hurt far more people than you help. Downstream industries, consumers, folks that get hit by retaliation, and on and on and on. But the other thing that I don't think we talk enough about is even the winners of protectionism often end up losers. Because they destroy demand for their products. If you raise the price of steel too high, suddenly people don't just say, oh, you got me, I'm going to pay. They just don't buy your steel. Go back to the Jones Act. We just don't make a lot of ships now because there's no demand for our insanely expensive ships that are made in the United States, right? So you combine that with lower economic growth, less economic dynamism, and the rest. And in the long term, you see, we've had footwear tariffs of really like 40% for decades and decades. We don't have a big shoe industry. And you can go down the list. Highly protected industries don't always come out smelling like a rose. They can exist, but they just kind of hang around as these kind of zombie industries with some jobs and a lot of lobbying clout, but not a lot of actual output and innovation. And that's, I think, one of the many hidden costs of protectionism. Well, with that, perfect timing. It is 4 o'clock. So I just want to thank you all for coming. Thank you all for online for watching. If you're around in Washington next week, a week from today, we'll be hosting Senators Rand Paul and Tim Kaine to talk about tariffs' effects on the American whiskey and wine industry, followed by a little whiskey and wine tasting reception as well. So if you can join us, please do. Thank you.